The bank lobby was bright, orderly, and unforgiving. At the counter, Stephen spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear as he asked the clerk to shut off every card linked to his wife's name. He explained calmly and publicly that Madison didn't earn money and had no right to spend it. A few heads turned. A pen paused mid-signature. Madison stood beside him without flinching, her face still, her hands empty. What no one in that room knew was that her phone held an unopened email, one that would soon make this moment impossible to erase. If you believe control should never be mistaken for love, stay with this story until the end. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if stories about quiet strength and legal truth matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. From the outside, the Campbell marriage looked ordinary in the way many American marriages do when viewed from a safe distance. A clean house in a quiet suburb. 2 cars in the driveway. A predictable routine that moved in sync with the work week. Nothing about it suggested imbalance, at least not to people who passed by without staying long enough to listen. Madison Campbell had learned early that stillness could be mistaken for weakness. She moved through her days with deliberate calm, not because she lacked thoughts, but because she had learned that speaking too soon often only gave others permission to dismiss her. At 34, she had the posture of someone accustomed to observing rooms before occupying them. She kept lists, mental and written. Grocery prices, calendar reminders, email drafts never sent. Patterns mattered to her. She believed they told the truth faster than arguments ever could. Stephen Campbell interpreted that quiet as absence. Stephen was the kind of man people trusted at first glance. He dressed well without looking like he tried. His voice carried the practiced confidence of someone who had spent years in meetings where being certain mattered more than being correct. He worked in financial consulting, long hours, performance metrics, quarterly reviews, and he wore that identity like proof of value. He believed contribution could be measured cleanly, preferably in numbers that appeared on statements with his name printed at the top. To Stephen, money was not just income. It was authority. In the early years of their marriage, the imbalance had been subtle. Madison had left her previous role after they married, a decision that appeared mutual on the surface. Stephen's career was taking off and someone needed to manage the rest of life. Madison had been capable, more than capable, but she also understood compromise. She told herself it was temporary. Stephen told himself it was logical. Over time, logic hardened into entitlement. Stephen paid the mortgage. Stephen paid the utilities. Stephen transferred money into their joint account and spoke about it as if it were a gift rather than a shared obligation. When Madison bought groceries or scheduled home repairs, he asked questions framed as concern but delivered like audits. Did we need this brand? Why now? Couldn't it wait until next month? Madison answered when asked. She did not defend. What Stephen never noticed was how Madison tracked each exchange, not out of resentment, but out of habit. She noted when discussions shifted from partnership to permission, when we slowly became I, when decisions that affected both of them required only one signature. The first card declined on a Tuesday afternoon at a neighborhood pharmacy. Madison had gone in for a prescription refill and a few household items. Nothing unusual. The register beeped once, then again. The cashier frowned apologetically and tried a second time. "I'm sorry," the cashier said. "It's saying the card is inactive." Madison didn't react. She asked the cashier to hold the item, stepped aside, and checked her phone. There was no fraud alert, no warning. Just a quiet notification from the bank app, card access suspended. She paid with a backup card Stephen rarely used. She left the store. She wrote down the time. At home that evening, Stephen explained it with the tone of someone correcting a misunderstanding, rather than announcing a decision. He said they needed to tighten things up. He said expenses had been creeping. He said it made sense for him to oversee spending for a while. He did not ask if she agreed. Madison listened. She nodded once. She did not argue. She wrote it down later after he had gone to bed. The pattern accelerated quickly after that. Stephen changed passwords on their shared accounts and said it was for security. He told Madison she could ask him if she needed anything. The phrasing was casual, almost generous, as if access were a favor rather than a right. Madison adjusted her routines. She planned purchases carefully. She avoided asking unless necessary. Each request was met with a pause, sometimes approval, sometimes dismissal. The unpredictability was the point. Stephen seemed to enjoy the moment of deciding. What Stephen didn't understand was that Madison was not idle during this time. Her days were not empty simply because they were not visible to him. While Stephen left for work each morning, believing himself to be the only source of forward motion, Madison opened her laptop and stepped into a different world, one that operated quietly, contractually, and with precision. But that world remained invisible to him. At social gatherings, Stephen spoke freely about responsibility. He joked about being the sole provider. He framed Madison's silence as agreement. People laughed politely. No one questioned the narrative because it fit a familiar mold. Madison never corrected him, not because she couldn't, but because she had learned the cost of premature disclosure. There were obligations tied to her work confidentiality clause's professional discretion. More than that, there was timing. She understood even then that truth revealed without preparation could be reframed, minimized, or attacked. Stephen mistook her restraint for dependence. He began making decisions unilaterally, larger ones, closing one account, redirecting funds, treating the joint account as an allowance system. Each action reinforced his belief that Madison existed downstream from him, not alongside him. Madison began to organize her records. She saved screenshots of notifications. She exported transaction histories. She kept copies of emails that referenced changes Stephen made without discussion. Her approach was methodical, unemotional. This was not revenge. It was documentation. The imbalance reached its clearest form in public spaces, where Stephen seemed most comfortable asserting it. He spoke louder when there were witnesses. He corrected Madison casually in front of others. Not cruelly, never overtly, but with enough confidence that no one felt invited to intervene. Madison noticed who looked away, who stayed silent, who assumed this was normal. Stephen believed his authority was unquestioned. He believed Madison's compliance confirmed his role as the responsible one. He believed money flowed in one direction, and therefore power did too. What Stephen did not realize, what he never thought to verify, was that his understanding of Madison's position was based on absence of information, not absence of activity. He had never asked what she did with her time. He had simply decided it wasn't worth asking. And Madison, who understood the difference between secrecy and strategy, allowed him to keep believing that, because from where she stood, the story was already moving toward an outcome Stephen could not control. Madison Campbell's professional life did not disappear when she stepped away from her full-time position after marriage. It changed shape. It became quieter, less visible, and ironically more precise. Before the suburban routines and shared calendars, Madison had worked in operations and contract coordination for a mid-sized technology firm. She had not been the face of the company or the voice in the room, but she had been the person others relied on when deadlines tightened and ambiguity threatened to derail progress. Her role had required fluency in details most people skimmed past: termination clauses, milestone triggers, compliance language that looked interchangeable until it wasn't. She had been good at it. Not brilliant in a way that demanded recognition, but dependable in the way organizations quietly survive on. When she left, it wasn't because she lacked ambition. It was because the structure of her life shifted faster than the structure of her career could accommodate. Stephen's hours expanded. His travel increased. The unspoken expectation settled in that someone would absorb the domestic margin. Madison, who had always been capable of holding multiple systems in her head, at once adjusted. What never occurred to Stephen was that capability doesn't dissolve simply because it's redirected. Madison's re-entry into professional work began slowly and without ceremony. A former colleague reached out with a question about a vendor agreement. Then another asked if she could review a revised contract timeline. Nothing that required office presence, nothing that demanded a title. Just clarity, precision, accountability. She accepted the work under clear terms. Short engagements, defined scopes, written agreements. She was careful about boundaries, not because she feared exposure, but because she understood how easily informal work could be dismissed or exploited. Her compensation reflected the work, not the hours. Retainers tied to deliverables. Payments triggered by verified milestones. Every detail documented. Every exchange archived. Madison did not advertise this work. She did not speak about it at dinner parties or mention it casually to Stephen. Not because she wanted to deceive him, but because the nature of the work required discretion. The contracts included non-disclosure clauses. The clients valued reliability, not publicity. And because on some level, Madison had learned that explaining herself rarely changed how Stephen listened. Her days followed a pattern Stephen never noticed. After he left for work, Madison reviewed email threads that extended across time zones. She annotated documents with tracked changes flagging inconsistencies that others had missed. She scheduled calls during narrow windows when decisions could be finalized without delay. She approached each task with the same calm thoroughness she applied to everything else. There was no urgency in her movements, no performative stress. She understood that the absence of panic was often mistaken for the absence of importance. Stephen never asked how she spent her mornings. When he did mention her not working, it was framed as observation, not inquiry. "You don't have to worry about that," he'd say, referring to money. Or, "I've got this covered." The implication was always the same. Her contribution was optional, his was essential. Madison absorbed those statements without comment. She noted the language. She noted the timing. She noted the way Stephen's confidence increased in proportion to how little he knew. Her contracts grew in complexity as trust solidified. She began coordinating between legal teams, ensuring revisions were captured correctly across versions. She flagged risks before they materialized. She built a reputation for being precise and unflappable. None of this required Stephen's approval. None of it intersected with the accounts he monitored. Madison used a separate system, one designed for professional transactions. Everything was traceable. Everything complied with tax and reporting requirements. She was not hiding income. She was operating independently. Stephen interpreted her independence as absence. He filled that absence with assumptions. At home, the imbalance continued. Stephen spoke more openly about his money. He treated access as leverage sometimes, without even realizing he was doing it. Madison responded by becoming more exact. She separated personal spending from shared obligations. She documented requests and responses. She stopped relying on memory. When Stephen tightened financial controls, Madison did not confront him with what she knew. She understood that knowledge without context could be reframed as threat. And Stephen, who viewed control as stability, would not respond well to having that perception challenged prematurely. Instead, Madison prepared. Her work reached a turning point during a series of negotiations, with a technology services firm preparing for a multi-phase rollout. The contracts were layered, contingent on performance metrics and compliance approvals. Madison coordinated across departments that rarely communicated well with one another. She ensured alignment not through authority, but through accuracy. Each successful milestone strengthened her position. Each signed document added weight to a foundation Stephen couldn't see. Madison remained cautious. She did not celebrate quietly or plan aloud. She understood that professional momentum was fragile, easily disrupted by distraction or miscalculation. She focused on execution. At the same time, Stephen's behavior grew more performative. He corrected her in front of others. He framed her requests as inconveniences. He began speaking about discipline and structure as if they were virtues he alone understood. Madison noticed the shift. She also noticed how often Stephen referenced her supposed inactivity as justification for his decisions. The narrative benefited him. It positioned him as responsible, her as dependent. Madison did not challenge the narrative. She let it stand because she knew narratives collapse fastest when confronted by evidence, not argument. As the contracts approached final approval, Madison reviewed every clause one last time. She verified signatures. She ensured compliance documentation was complete. She confirmed payment mechanisms were set up correctly with clear audit trails. When the final confirmation emails arrived, she did not open them immediately. She waited until she had finished her other tasks for the day. She logged out of her work accounts. She returned her attention to the house Stephen believed defined her role. That evening, Stephen commented again on expenses. He spoke casually, as if reminding her of a fact she had forgotten. Madison nodded. She cleared the table. She washed the dishes. Later alone, she opened the email. The language was simple, direct, final. The contracts were approved. The next phase would proceed as scheduled. Madison archived the message. She did not feel vindicated. She felt prepared. Because she understood something Stephen never had, that power, when rooted in control, rather than contribution, always reveals itself eventually. And when it does, it rarely does so gently. Madison closed her laptop and turned off the light. The process was moving forward, exactly as planned. Stephen Campbell did not think of himself as controlling. He thought of himself as responsible. In his mind, the changes he made were practical adjustments, corrections, really to a system he believed had grown inefficient. Money, after all, needed structure, oversight, a single point of decision. Stephen had spent years in an industry that rewarded consolidation of authority. He saw no reason why marriage should operate differently. The first major shift happened quietly. One morning, Madison opened her banking app and found that the joint account displayed fewer permissions than it had the day before. Her access had not been removed entirely, just limited. Certain functions were unavailable. Transfers required authorization. Alerts were rerouted. Stephen mentioned it that evening as an afterthought. "I tightened up some settings," he said, scrolling through his phone while Madison stood at the kitchen counter. "Just for clarity. Nothing for you to worry about." Madison asked one question. "Did anything change that I need to know?" Stephen didn't look up. "No. If you need something, just tell me." It was framed as reassurance. It landed as instruction. Over the following weeks, Stephen expanded the system. He canceled one card and replaced it with another, registered solely in his name. He adjusted spending limits. He set daily caps. He justified each decision with language that sounded reasonable when isolated, but collectively formed a pattern Madison recognized immediately. This was not budgeting. It was gatekeeping. Stephen began referring to the money as something he handled. He spoke about expenses as if they were requests made of him personally rather than shared responsibilities. When Madison mentioned upcoming household costs, he nodded slowly, sometimes approving, sometimes delaying. "Let's wait," he would say, or "That's not necessary right now." Madison noticed how often "right now" became indefinite. She adjusted without protest. She consolidated her needs. She reduced visibility. She stopped asking unless necessary. Not because she agreed with Stephen's authority, but because she understood escalation rarely favored the person who spoke first. Stephen interpreted her compliance as confirmation. He became more explicit. He told Madison it was important for her to understand where money comes from. He said discipline was a form of care. He said many families failed because they didn't respect financial hierarchy. Madison listened. She recorded the dates. The moment Stephen fully crossed from assumption into enforcement came one evening when Madison returned from running errands with only half the items on her list. She explained that one of her cards had been declined again. Stephen sighed, not angrily, disappointedly. "I thought we talked about this," he said. "If you need to use money, you should check with me first." Madison met his eyes. It was for the house. Stephen shrugged. Still, the word lingered between them heavier than it should have been. That night, Madison updated her records. She saved the decline notification. She noted Stephen's response verbatim. She attached context. She did not label it as abuse. She simply described what had happened. Stephen continued refining his system. He removed Madison's access to certain statements. He redirected mail. He framed everything as efficiency. When Madison asked for transparency, he responded with confusion. "Why do you need to see everything?" he asked. "Don't you trust me?" The irony did not escape her. At a family gathering, Stephen joked about being the only one who understood finances. He laughed about keeping things under control. Someone commented on how lucky Madison was to have a husband who handled everything. Madison smiled politely. Stephen noticed her silence and mistook it for gratitude. What Stephen did not realize was that Madison was learning the precise contours of his behavior. Not through speculation, but through observation. She saw how he justified himself to others, how he softened language when challenged, how he avoided specifics when asked direct questions. She noticed how his confidence increased in public and hardened in private. Stephen began using money to end conversations. If Madison raised a concern unrelated to finances, he redirected it. If she expressed discomfort, he reframed it as misunderstanding. He reminded her subtly of dependence. "You don't have to worry about those things," he would say. "I've got it covered." Madison heard the subtext clearly. "You don't need to decide." She began storing her documentation in a secure, separate location. She organized it chronologically. She created summaries. She did not share any of it. This was not preparation for confrontation. It was preparation for clarity. Stephen's behavior grew more rigid as time passed. He spoke less about partnership and more about order. He referred to his decisions as final. He stopped explaining. Madison noticed the shift from persuasion to expectation. One afternoon, Stephen informed her that he had closed one of their secondary accounts. He did not ask. He announced. It wasn't doing anything he said. No point keeping it open. Madison asked, "Did you move the funds?" Stephen hesitated for half a second. "Of course." She asked, "Where?" Stephen answered vaguely. "It's handled." Madison wrote it down. Stephen did not notice the precision with which she asked her questions. He did not notice that she stopped reacting emotionally. He mistook neutrality for submission. In reality, Madison was disengaging from the illusion that Stephen's control was absolute. She could see its edges now. She could see where it relied on her silence to function. Stephen's tone shifted further. He began to use money to reward compliance. When Madison agreed quickly, he was generous. When she hesitated, he withdrew. He called this balance. Madison recognized it as conditioning. Still, she did not confront him. She did not accuse him. She did not threaten. She understood that naming behavior without leverage often only provoked escalation. Instead, she focused on accuracy. She ensured her professional accounts were insulated. She verified that her work income remained separate and documented. She reviewed her legal rights quietly, without alarm. Stephen continued believing he was in control because nothing challenged him. He did not see the difference between lack of resistance and lack of power. At night, Madison lay awake, not with fear, but with calculation. She did not plan revenge. She planned stability. Stephen slept easily. He believed the system was working. The dinner was supposed to be casual. That was how Stephen described it when he mentioned it earlier that week, just family, nothing formal. Madison understood what that usually meant. Casual for Stephen often translated to unguarded, a space where he felt comfortable enough to speak without editing himself. They drove to his sister's house just after sunset. The neighborhood was familiar, comfortable, the kind of place where people left porch lights on and doors unlocked during gatherings. Madison brought a bottle of wine Stephen had chosen. He said it was appropriate. She didn't question it. Inside the house was warm with conversation. Plates clinked. Someone laughed too loudly. Stephen moved easily through the room, greeting relatives and old friends with the ease of someone accustomed to being listened to. Madison followed a few steps behind, offering polite smiles, answering questions briefly, never lingering too long in any one exchange. She noticed the seating arrangement without comment. Stephen was placed at the head of the table, a position he accepted without hesitation. Madison took the chair beside him. It was close enough to be seen together, far enough to be separate. The conversation drifted the way these gatherings always did. Work knew someone's upcoming vacation. When Stephen spoke about his job, people leaned in. When Madison spoke, they nodded politely and turned back to Stephen. At some point, someone asked Madison what she'd been doing lately. It was an open question, not unkind. Stephen answered before she could. "She's been taking it easy," he said with a smile, "keeping things running at home." There was a ripple of approving murmurs. Someone joked about how nice that must be. Stephen chuckled. "Someone has to manage the real chaos," he added. "I handle the finances. She handles the rest." Madison felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not pain exactly, but pressure. She reached for her water glass, steadying her hand. Another guest laughed and said, "That's a good system." Stephen nodded. "It works, as long as everyone knows their role." The words were delivered lightly. They landed heavily. As dinner continued, Stephen grew more relaxed. He told stories. He reenacted moments from work. He spoke with the confidence of someone performing for an audience that had already decided to be impressed. Then, without warning, he shifted. "We actually had to tighten up spending recently," he said, spearing a piece of food with his fork. "Turns out it's easy to overspend when you're not earning." The table went quiet for half a second, just long enough to register the change. Stephen continued unfazed. "It's not a problem. We're working on discipline." Someone laughed uncertainly. Someone else looked down at their plate. Madison did not look at Stephen. She kept her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. Inside, she marked the moment clearly. Time, place, witnesses. Stephen leaned back in his chair. "I mean, it's simple. If you're not bringing in money, you shouldn't be surprised when someone else manages it." There it was. Not shouted, not dramatic, just stated as fact. Madison felt her phone vibrate against her leg. Once, then again. She did not reach for it. The silence stretched. Stephen noticed finally and glanced at her with mild irritation, as if expecting her to play along. She met his eyes briefly, then looked back at her plate. Someone changed the subject too quickly. Another person poured more wine. The moment passed in the way uncomfortable moments often do, not resolved, just buried. Madison excused herself after dessert, offering help in the kitchen. She welcomed the distance as she rinsed dishes. She could still hear Stephen talking in the other room, his voice carrying easily over the noise. "He means well," someone said. "He's just practical." Madison dried her hands slowly. When they left, Stephen seemed satisfied. He commented on how well the evening had gone. He mentioned how supportive his family was. "You didn't have to get so quiet," he said as they drove home. "Not angry, observational. It makes people uncomfortable." Madison watched the streetlights pass. "I didn't think it was my turn to speak." Stephen scoffed. "You don't have to take everything so personally." She did not respond. At home, she went through her usual routine. She changed clothes. She set her phone on the nightstand. Stephen disappeared into his office, still energized by the attention. Only then did Madison unlock her phone. The email notification was still there. The subject line was neutral, almost boring: milestone confirmation phase 2. She'd opened it carefully, reading each line without rushing. The language was precise. Approval confirmed. Next steps outlined. Payment scheduled upon final verification. She closed the email without replying. She saved a copy. She archived it. Madison sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, letting the quiet settle. The evening replayed in her mind, not emotionally, but structurally. The way Stephen had spoken, the way others had responded, the way the narrative had been accepted without challenge. She opened a notebook and wrote down the details. Who was present? What was said? How it was framed? This was not about humiliation. It was about pattern. Stephen came into the bedroom later, still talking, still buoyant. He kissed her cheek distractedly and began scrolling through his phone. You know, he said it's important that we're on the same page, especially in front of people. Madison nodded. I understand. Stephen smiled, satisfied. He turned off the light. Madison lay awake long after he fell asleep, listening to his breathing even out. She did not feel angry. She felt clear. The dinner had confirmed something she already knew, but hadn't yet seen. So plainly, Stephen was comfortable diminishing her, as long as it reinforced his position. He did not need to be cruel. He only needed to be believed. Madison stared at the ceiling, her mind steady. The story Stephen told about her was simple, convenient, familiar, and it was built entirely on the assumption that she had nothing to contradict it. The contracts did not arrive all at once. They never did. Progress in Madison's world came in increments. Small approvals, revised language, conditional confirmations that only mattered if you understood how they connected. Phase 2 had been approved, but that approval triggered a cascade of obligations. Madison spent the next few weeks moving quietly between documents and conversations, ensuring that every piece aligned before the next could proceed. She knew better than to celebrate milestones prematurely. In her experience, momentum was fragile and confidence was best kept internal. Her mornings began early before Stephen left for work. She brewed coffee, reviewed overnight emails, and flagged anything that required immediate attention. Most messages were procedural questions about deliverables, clarifications on timelines, but a few carried weight. These were the ones that could delay payment if mishandled or expose risk if rushed. Madison treated each with the same care. The technology firm she was coordinating with operated across several states, which meant compliance varied by jurisdiction. Madison tracked the differences meticulously. She cross-referenced regulatory language. She ensured that internal teams and external vendors were working from the same version of each document. She did this without a title, without an office, and without anyone announcing her importance. The people who mattered knew exactly why she was there. Stephen remained unaware. When he left each morning, he assumed Madison's day would revolve around errands, household maintenance, and whatever he believed filled the idle hours of someone without a paycheck. He did not ask. He did not need to. His confidence rested on the absence of contradiction. Madison rarely worked from the same place twice in a row. Sometimes it was the kitchen table. Sometimes a quiet corner of the public library. Occasionally a cafe where she could blend into background noise. She valued environments that allowed her to observe without being observed. Her phone stayed face down during calls. Her notes were handwritten before being digitized. She kept backups in multiple locations. Precision was not paranoia. It was habit. As Phase 2 closed, Phase 3 began to take shape. This stage involved integration, moving from agreement to execution. Madison coordinated between engineering leads, procurement officers, and legal advisors who spoke different professional languages and often misunderstood one another. Her role was to translate intent into enforceable terms. She did not dominate conversations. She guided them. When someone proposed a shortcut, Madison asked how it would be documented. When someone assumed approval, she asked where it was recorded. These questions slowed meetings slightly, but they prevented future disputes. Over time, people learned to listen when she spoke. The contracts grew more valuable as they progressed, not in spectacle, but in structure. Each successful phase increased the scope of the agreement. Each completed deliverable triggered the next set of conditions. Madison tracked everything in a private ledger, dates, confirmations, dependencies. She knew exactly where each agreement stood and what would happen next. She could predict delays before they occurred. She could see leverage where others saw routine. At home, Stephen's behavior remained unchanged. He continued to manage money unilaterally. He continued to speak about expenses as decisions he made alone. He continued to believe Madison's silence indicated acceptance. One evening, Stephen mentioned cutting back on unnecessary spending again. He suggested Madison plan purchases more carefully. He framed it as teamwork. Madison listened. She asked no questions. She simply noted the date. Her work demanded attention that Stephen never noticed. She scheduled calls during hours he was in meetings. She muted notifications when he was home. She understood that invisibility was an asset until it wasn't. The most delicate part of the process came when the final approvals approached. This phase required coordination across multiple departments, each with its own risk tolerance. Madison prepared briefing documents that distilled complexity into clarity. She anticipated objections. She addressed them before they surfaced. When a senior stakeholder hesitated, Madison did not push. She provided data. When legal teams raised concerns, she responded with citations. She did not argue. She demonstrated. Trust followed. The final documents were circulated with minimal fanfare. Madison reviewed each line, comparing it to earlier versions. She confirmed that every change had been authorized. She ensured that signatures matched approvals. Only when everything aligned did she forward the documents for execution. The confirmation email arrived late in the afternoon. Madison read it once, then again. The language was formal, definitive. The phase was complete. The next payment would be scheduled according to the agreed timeline. She closed her laptop and took a breath. There was no rush of triumph, no sense of vindication, just a quiet acknowledgement that the system had worked as designed. Stephen arrived home that evening in a good mood. He talked about a meeting that had gone well. He mentioned a colleague's mistake with mild amusement. He asked Madison what she had done that day. Just caught up on a few things, she said. Stephen nodded, satisfied. He did not see the difference between catching up and closing. Over the next few days, Madison prepared for what came next. She coordinated final invoices. She verified payment channels. She confirmed audit trails. Everything was documented, transparent, and compliant. She did not transfer any funds. She did not alert Stephen. She did not change her behavior. The work required patience now. The system would move at its own pace. Interfering would only steady it against her. Stephen grew more confident as time passed. His tone softened slightly, as if he believed the financial restrictions had achieved their purpose. He spoke less sharply. He seemed pleased with himself. Madison observed the shift without comment. She understood that Stephen's confidence was built on a false premise that he knew the full scope of their financial reality. That assumption allowed him to feel secure. It allowed him to relax. Madison did not correct it. Instead, she focused on maintaining balance. She kept her records current. She reviewed her documentation weekly. She stayed in close contact with her professional contacts, responding promptly, precisely. The contracts were no longer hypothetical. They were operational. Madison understood that timing mattered as much as truth. Revealing information too early could distort it. Revealing it too late could limit its impact. She waited, because she knew something Stephen did not. That control based on incomplete information is temporary by nature. And when it dissolves, it does so not through confrontation, but through exposure. Madison closed her notebook and set it aside. The process was nearing its end. Stephen chose the bank deliberately. He framed it as efficiency. "We're already in the area," he said that morning, but Madison recognized the calculation immediately. Banks to Stephen represented authority, structure, validation. He believed that if something was declared within those walls, it carried more weight simply because of where it was said. Madison agreed to go without comment. The branch was one Stephen liked. Clean lines, private desks, the kind of place where clients were greeted by name if they came often enough. Stephen walked in with the ease of familiarity, nodding to a teller he recognized. Madison followed, carrying nothing but her phone and a small notebook tucked into her bag. They were directed to a service desk near the front. The space was open enough that nearby customers could hear fragments of conversation without intending to. Stephen did not lower his voice. "There's been a problem with card access," he said to the banker, a woman in her 40s, with a calm, professional expression. "I asked for all secondary cards to be suspended." The banker glanced at her screen. "I see the changes," she said. "May I ask which cards you're referring to?" Stephen gestured casually toward Madison. "Hers." The word landed with more force than he intended, or perhaps exactly as much as he intended. Madison stood still. She kept her expression neutral. She did not interrupt. The banker looked between them. "Are you requesting permanent deactivation or temporary suspension?" "Permanent," Stephen said. "She doesn't need them." There it was, clear, public. A pause followed, not awkward but noticeable. The banker's fingers hovered over her keyboard. "For our records," she said carefully, "I'll need confirmation that you're the sole authorized user for those accounts." "I am," Stephen said. "I handle all finances." Madison watched the banker's eyes flicker briefly, professional but alert. People waiting behind them shifted slightly. A man pretending to read his phone glanced up. "And your wife?" the banker asked. Stephen sighed, the sound edged with impatience. "She doesn't earn money. There's no reason for her to have independent access." Madison felt the room register the sentence. Not with outrage, with attention. She could feel it, the collective awareness that something private was being declared publicly. The banker nodded once. "Understood. I'll process the request." Madison spoke for the first time. "Before you do," she said, her voice even, "could I have a printed record of the changes being made today?" Stephen turned toward her, surprised. "Why, so I can keep my files updated," Madison replied. The banker hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." She printed the document and slid it across the desk. Madison glanced at it briefly, noting the date, time, and account numbers referenced. She folded it neatly and placed it in her bag. Stephen frowned. "You don't need that." Madison looked at him calmly. "It's fine." The banker completed the process. "The cards are now deactivated," she said. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" Stephen smiled, satisfied. "No, that'll be all." They turned to leave. As they walked toward the exit, Madison noticed the security cameras mounted discreetly near the ceiling. She noted their positions automatically, the way she noted everything else. She did not look at them directly. Outside, Stephen exhaled, as if relieved. "That should clear things up," he said. Madison said nothing. In the car, Stephen's tone shifted from performative to explanatory. "I didn't mean to embarrass you," he said. "But this is what structure looks like." Madison stared out the window. "You were clear." Stephen nodded. "Good. Then we're aligned." Madison did not correct him. That evening, she reviewed the printed record carefully. The language was precise. The authorization was explicit. Stephen had not simply restricted access. He had declared sole control. The document included his signature, time-stamped and verified. She scanned it and saved a digital copy. She backed it up. She labeled it neutrally. She did not feel angry. She felt confirmed. Over the next few days, Stephen mentioned the bank visit casually, as if it were a minor administrative task. He joked once about how dramatic banks could be. He seemed unaware that the moment had lodged itself firmly in Madison's memory, not as an insult, but as evidence. Madison adjusted her routines again. She stopped attempting to use any shared cards. She paid exclusively through her separate professional account when necessary. She maintained the appearance of compliance. Stephen relaxed. He began to speak with more confidence, believing the matter settled. He referenced the bank visit as proof that he had acted responsibly. He framed it as a necessary correction. Madison listened. The shift came quietly. One afternoon, while Stephen was at work, Madison received a call from an unfamiliar number. She let it go to voicemail. When she listened later, it was a brief message from the bank. "Mrs. Campbell, this is regarding a recent account change. Please call us back when you have a moment." Madison waited. When she returned the call, she asked to speak with the same banker from earlier in the week. The woman recognized her voice. "I just wanted to confirm I received the correct documentation," Madison said. and to ask about account history access. There was a pause in the line. Your access is limited, the banker said carefully, but I can confirm records upon request. Thank you, Madison replied. That's all I needed to know. She ended the call and noted the interaction. Stephen did not know the bank had reached out. He did not know Madison had called back. He believed the system was closed, settled final. Madison knew better. She began organizing her materials more deliberately. The bank document went into a folder labeled by category, not emotion. She cross-referenced it with earlier notifications messages Stephen had sent and notes she had taken during conversations. A pattern emerged clearly. Not just control, but escalation. Not just oversight, but exclusion. Madison did not label it abuse. She let the facts speak for themselves. Stephen continued living as if nothing had changed. He believed the bank visit had reinforced his authority. He did not anticipate consequence because he did not believe he had done anything wrong. Madison observed the gap between his belief and reality widening. She did not rush to close it because she understood something Stephen never had, that public declarations create records. And records once created do not disappear simply because someone wishes them to. The bank visit had not been a display of power. It had been a submission of proof. Madison did not look for a lawyer the way people often did late at night, driven by panic, typing vague questions into a search bar. She approached it the same way she approached everything else, deliberately. She waited 3 days after the bank incident. Not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted distance. Distance sharpened judgment. It stripped emotion from memory and left only sequence. When she finally made the call, she did so from her car parked 2 blocks away from the public library. She had already reviewed several firms. She was not looking for aggression or theatrics. She wanted precision. Lauren Whitman's office was small, quiet, and intentionally unremarkable. Family law, financial abuse, asset protection. The website language was restrained. No promises, no slogans, just process. Madison scheduled a consultation under her own name. The meeting took place on a Thursday morning. Madison arrived early carrying a slim folder. She wore nothing that suggested urgency. Lauren greeted her with a neutral smile and offered coffee. Madison declined. They sat across from each other at a plain table. No interruptions, no assistants hovering nearby. Lauren began, as she always did. Tell me what brings you here. Madison did not begin with Stephen's personality. She did not describe how she felt. She began with dates. 3 months ago, she said my access to joint accounts was restricted without discussion. 2 weeks later, secondary cards were deactivated. On Monday, those changes were made permanent at a bank branch in public. Lauren listened without interruption. She did not nod excessively. She took notes. Madison slid the printed bank record across the table. This is the authorization. Lauren examined it carefully. She did not react outwardly, but something in her posture shifted. Did you consent to this? No. Were you informed in advance? No. Lauren made another note. Do you have records of the earlier changes? Madison opened the folder. Screenshots, notifications, a timeline typed neatly, dates, times, verbatim quotes from messages Stephen had sent. Lauren reviewed them slowly. Has he ever explained why these changes were necessary? He says it's discipline, Madison replied, and responsibility. Lauren looked up. Has he asked about your income? No. Do you have income? Yes. Lauren paused. Is it documented? Yes. Separate from joint accounts? Yes. Lauren closed the folder gently. Good. Madison did not ask what that meant. She waited. Lauren leaned back slightly. What you're describing fits a pattern we see often. Financial control escalating into exclusion. The public nature of the bank incident matters. Madison's expression remained calm. Because there were witnesses and records, Lauren said. Institutions document everything, especially when requests are explicit. Madison nodded. I assumed as much. Lauren studied her for a moment. What outcome are you seeking? Madison considered the question. Clarity, protection. I don't want to argue about intent. I want facts. Lauren smiled faintly. That helps. They discussed options, not ultimatums, procedures. Lauren explained discovery, documentation, the importance of not alerting Stephen prematurely, the risks of confrontation without preparation. You don't need to prove he's a bad person, Lauren said. You need to show what he did. Madison appreciated the phrasing. Lauren continued. The next step would be to formally document the restriction of access and the unilateral control. We'll need complete bank records, communications, anything that establishes a timeline. I have those, Madison said. I assumed you might. Lauren replied. They spoke about financial safeguards, about ensuring Madison's independent accounts were secure, about separating future income streams cleanly. Lauren did not ask Madison to disclose numbers. She asked for verification. Madison provided it. By the end of the meeting, there was no dramatic resolution, no promises of justice delivered swiftly, just a plan. Lauren summarized it carefully. You continue as you have been. Don't change behavior. Don't confront him. If he escalates, you document. If he doesn't, we proceed methodically. Madison stood. And if he asks about why you're documenting, yes, then you tell the truth, Lauren said, that you like keeping records. Madison nodded. That won't surprise him. As Madison left the office, she felt no sense of relief. Relief implied release. What she felt instead was alignment. Her instincts had not been wrong. They had simply needed structure. At home, nothing changed. Stephen asked about her day. Madison answered truthfully, selectively. I ran errands, took care of some paperwork. Stephen nodded, uninterested. Over the next week, Madison refined her system. She scanned additional documents. She requested historical statements through proper channels. She cross-referenced transaction dates with Stephen's explanations. Lauren checked in once briefly to confirm receipt. No long conversations, no emotional processing, just confirmation. Stephen grew more comfortable. His tone softened again. He seemed pleased with the order he believed he had restored. He spoke about future plans as if nothing beneath them had shifted. Madison observed him closely. She noted how he referenced money, how he described decisions, how he assumed finality. She did not challenge any of it. One evening, Stephen mentioned the bank visit again, this time with humor. You should have seen the look on that banker's face, he said, laughing. People take things so seriously. Madison smiled faintly. They're trained to. Stephen shrugged. Rules are rules. Madison agreed silently. In her private records, she added another entry bank visit referenced casually. No acknowledgement of impact. Lauren's strategy required patience. Madison had it. She understood that the strongest cases were rarely built in moments of crisis. They were built in consistency. She continued working. She continued documenting. She continued maintaining the appearance of compliance. Stephen did not notice the difference between compliance and preparation. Weeks passed. Madison's professional work continued to advance unseen. Contracts moved closer to execution. Payments neared initiation. Everything followed its timeline. Lauren requested one additional item authorization forms to access certain records once proceedings began. Madison signed them without hesitation. The system was in motion. Madison did not feel triumphant. She felt steady. She understood now that she did not need to convince Stephen of anything. She did not need him to admit fault or recognize harm. The process did not depend on his understanding. It depended on facts. And facts, once assembled, did not require permission to exist. Madison closed her notebook that night and placed it back in its drawer. The next phase would come soon enough. Stephen's confidence grew in the absence of resistance. It always had. In the weeks following the bank visit, he moved through the house with an ease that bordered on satisfaction. The boundaries he had drawn remained uncontested. Madison did not ask for access. She did not question his decisions. She did not challenge the story he told himself about order being restored. To Stephen, this silence confirmed everything. He began speaking more freely again at work with friends, even at home. He joked about how complicated finances could be if you didn't know what you were doing. He told a colleague over speakerphone one evening that some people just weren't built to handle responsibility. Madison listened from the kitchen, her back turned, measuring ingredients with steady hands. Stephen's language shifted subtly. He stopped using we when discussing money and replaced it with I. He talked about plans, investments, trips, upgrades without consulting Madison. He assumed agreement where none had been given. When Madison mentioned practical needs, Stephen responded with indulgent patience. "We'll see," he'd say. Or, "That's not urgent." Urgency in Stephen's mind was reserved for things that interested him. Madison noticed how often he referenced her supposed dependence when speaking to others. He framed it as care, protection, sacrifice. People nodded sympathetically. No one questioned him. He began spending more freely on himself. New clothes, dinners out with colleagues, a weekend trip he described as networking. The irony that he justified restriction by claiming financial prudence while indulging himself did not seem to register. Madison tracked it anyway. She compared dates. She matched transactions to conversations. She noticed how Stephen's spending increased in proportion to his confidence. He was no longer conserving. He was asserting. Lauren's earlier words echoed quietly in Madison's mind. Patterns matter. Stephen's behavior formed one quickly. He transferred funds between accounts without explanation. He closed another account Madison hadn't known he still used. He dismissed her questions with vague assurances. "It's handled" became his favorite phrase. Madison asked fewer questions. Not because she lacked curiosity, but because she understood Stephen revealed more when he felt unobserved. The less she pushed, the more he assumed safety. One afternoon, Stephen came home unusually animated. He talked about a potential opportunity, nothing concrete, just the possibility of something bigger. He spoke about risk the way he always did, abstractly, optimistically, without acknowledging consequences. Madison asked one question. "Is it confirmed?" Stephen waved it off. "Not yet, but it will be." Madison nodded. She wrote it down later. Stephen did not notice the shift in how Madison listened. She no longer engaged emotionally. She listened structurally. Every statement was a data point, every assumption a marker. At the same time, Madison's professional world moved steadily forward. The contracts she had coordinated entered their execution phase. Invoices were drafted, payment schedules confirmed. Everything remained within the bounds of procedure. She did not rush it. She knew better than to interfere with systems designed to protect themselves. Stephen remained oblivious. He interpreted Madison's continued quiet as acceptance. He assumed she had adjusted to her role. He told himself that discipline had worked. One evening he said as much aloud. "I think this was necessary," he said, leaning back on the couch. "You seem calmer." Madison looked at him. "Do I?" Stephen nodded. "Yeah, less stressed." Madison did not correct him. What Stephen did not understand was that Madison's calm had nothing to do with submission. It came from clarity. The uncertainty that had once unsettled her had been replaced by process. Stephen, emboldened by his own narrative, grew careless. He began leaving paperwork out. Not sensitive documents, he was still cautious, but enough to reveal habits. He took calls in shared spaces. He spoke more openly about moving money, about rearranging accounts. Madison noticed discrepancies between what he said and what the records showed. She did not confront him. Instead, she forwarded certain observations to Lauren, carefully worded, factual, unemotional. Lauren acknowledged receipt. She asked for copies. Madison provided them. The file grew thicker. Stephen's tone toward Madison shifted again, this time toward condescension. He offered advice she hadn't asked for. He explained basic concepts as if she were unfamiliar with them. He reminded her often how fortunate she was not to have to worry about money. Madison smiled politely. At a small gathering with Stephen's colleagues, someone asked Madison what she did. Stephen answered before she could. "She doesn't work," he said with an easy laugh. "She doesn't need to." Madison felt several eyes turn toward her. Curious, assessing. She nodded once. That's one way to put it. Stephen laughed. The moment passed. Later that night, Madison recorded the exchange. She included the setting, the witnesses, the phrasing. This was not about embarrassment. It was about narrative consistency. Stephen's story about Madison depended on repetition. The more often it was told, the more real it seemed. But repetition also created records. Witnesses remembered. Patterns formed. Stephen assumed Madison lacked leverage because she lacked visibility. He did not understand that visibility was not the same as power. The first sign that Stephen's confidence had crossed into recklessness came with a transaction Madison hadn't anticipated. A large transfer. Poorly timed, poorly explained. Madison flagged it immediately. She checked the date. She checked the account. She compared it to previous behavior. She sent a brief message to Lauren, new transfer. Details attached. Lauren responded an hour later. Received. Keep going, Madison did. Stephen noticed nothing. He slept well. He believed himself secure. Madison, lying awake beside him, did not feel fear. She felt readiness. She understood now that Stephen's greatest vulnerability was not malice. It was certainty. He was so convinced of his authority that he had stopped verifying it. And certainty, Madison knew, was dangerous when it went unchecked. The groundwork was laid. The documentation was solid. The timeline was clear. Stephen thought Madison had nowhere to go. In reality, she had already arrived. The payment did not arrive with drama. There was no alert that rang louder than usual, no message written in celebratory language. It appeared the way legitimate transactions always did, quietly, predictably, exactly as outlined in the agreement. Madison noticed it late in the morning after finishing a call that had required more listening than speaking. She refreshed her account once, not because she doubted the process, but because confirmation mattered. The numbers were there. The reference matched the invoice. The timing aligned with the milestone schedule. She closed the app without lingering. This was not the moment Stephen imagined when he spoke about money as power. There was no rush of emotion, no desire to announce. The funds represented completion, not conquest. They were the result of a system functioning correctly, not a victory over anyone. Madison documented the deposit the same way she documented everything else. Date, amount, source, purpose. She attached the invoice, the approval email, the contract clause that governed payment. Each file was labeled neutrally. Nothing about it referenced Stephen. She did not move the money. That decision was intentional. Lauren had been clear: avoid sudden shifts that could be misinterpreted. Maintain consistency. Let the facts accumulate without interference. Madison returned to her work. Phase 3 demanded attention now. Implementation always exposed weaknesses agreements could hide. Madison coordinated final checks, ensuring deliverables matched expectations. She responded to emails promptly. She corrected discrepancies before they escalated. Stephen came home that evening tired and distracted. He spoke about a long meeting. He mentioned delays at work. He complained briefly about inefficiency. Madison listened, offering acknowledgement without engagement. Stephen glanced at her. "Everything okay?" "Yes," Madison said. "Just busy." Stephen nodded, reassured by the familiarity of the answer. Over the next week, additional payments followed, according to schedule. Not all at once. Incremental, predictable, each accompanied by documentation. Madison treated each the same way: verified, recorded, archived. She did not adjust her spending. She did not change her behavior. She continued asking Stephen for access when necessary, accepting his responses without reaction. Stephen noticed nothing. His confidence remained intact. He spoke about finances with the same authority. He continued managing shared accounts unilaterally. He assumed Madison's dependence was unchanged. Madison understood the importance of timing now more than ever. Revealing income prematurely could invite scrutiny or retaliation. It could complicate proceedings before they were formally initiated. Lauren had advised patience, so Madison waited. She updated Lauren once concisely. Phase 3 executed. Payments received as scheduled. Documentation complete. Lauren replied later that evening. Good. Do not disclose. Will incorporate when discovery opens. Madison acknowledged the message and returned to her routine. Stephen's behavior shifted subtly as his own pressures increased. He grew irritable when work frustrated him. He spoke more sharply when plans didn't go his way. He leaned harder on the certainty he believed money provided. One night, he mentioned a purchase he wanted to make, something significant. He framed it as necessary, then as deserved. Madison asked, "Have you already decided?" Stephen frowned. "Of course." Why, Madison shrugged. "Just asking." Stephen waved the question away. "I don't need permission." The statement hung in the air longer than he intended. Madison did not respond. Later alone, she added it to her notes. Not because it was new, but because it was explicit. The next few days passed without incident. Stephen remained unaware. Madison remained steady. Then came the email that marked the shift. It arrived mid-afternoon, addressed to Madison directly with several executives copied. The subject line was straightforward: execution confirmation, final phase. Madison read it carefully. The language confirmed completion. The partnership was now operational. The scope expanded. Future payments would follow a revised schedule. She saved the email. She forwarded a copy to Lauren with a single line. "Final phase executed." Lauren responded within the hour. "Understood? This strengthens your position significantly." Madison felt no surge of satisfaction, only a quiet acknowledgement that the structure was now complete. That evening, Stephen brought up money again. He mentioned reviewing accounts. He commented on cash flow. He said things were tightening up. Madison listened. She asked no questions. Stephen misinterpreted her silence as agreement. He believed the constraints he imposed had produced the desired outcome. He spoke about discipline with renewed confidence. Madison watched him carefully. She noted the disconnect between his perception and reality widening. The contrast was stark now. Stephen spoke from assumption. Madison operated from documentation. She began preparing mentally for the next phase, not emotionally, but procedurally. Discovery would open soon. Requests would be made. Records would be examined. She reviewed her files one more time, ensuring everything was complete and accessible. She verified backups. She cross-checked timelines. Nothing was missing. Stephen continued living as if nothing had changed. He planned. He spent. He spoke. Madison observed. One afternoon, Stephen made an offhand remark that confirmed his certainty. "You don't need to worry," he said. "You're taken care of." Madison met his gaze. "I know." Stephen smiled, hearing reassurance where none had been offered. That night, Madison lay awake, not from anxiety, but from anticipation. Not of confrontation, but of process. She understood that truth did not need to be announced. It needed to be revealed in the correct context. The money was not leverage. It was evidence. And evidence, once introduced properly, did not argue. It simply existed. Madison turned off the light and closed her eyes. The system was ready. Discovery did not arrive with confrontation. It arrived with paperwork. Lauren Whitman sent the first formal notice on a Monday morning, timed deliberately to coincide with standard business hours. There was no dramatic language, no accusations embedded in the filing. The request was narrow, precise, and grounded entirely in documented events. Financial records, account authorizations, communication logs related to access changes. Stephen received the notice at work. He read it twice before it registered as something other than an administrative inconvenience. At first, he assumed it was a mistake, an error triggered by routine compliance or a misfiled document. He forwarded it to his assistant with a brief note, asking her to check what this is about. By lunchtime, he knew it wasn't a mistake. The requests were specific. Too specific. They referenced dates he recognized, actions he remembered taking, and accounts he believed were firmly under his control. The language did not accuse him of wrongdoing. It simply asked him to explain it. Stephen felt a flicker of irritation, quickly replaced by confidence. He believed explanations would be enough. He believed intent mattered more than impact. He believed he could clarify everything easily. At home that evening, he mentioned the notice casually. Some legal paperwork came through, he said, as if describing a delayed delivery. Nothing serious. Probably just routine. Madison looked up from her book. What kind of paperwork? Financial disclosure, Stephen replied. They want records. Standard stuff. Madison nodded. Okay. Stephen waited for more. Questions, concern, something. Nothing came. He took her calm as reassurance. He did not consider that she already knew. Over the next few days, Stephen gathered documents. He printed statements. He forwarded emails. He reviewed transactions, quickly convinced that context would favor him. He did not consult a lawyer. He believed the matter too small to require one. Madison observed from a distance. Lauren, meanwhile, began assembling the materials Madison had provided into a coherent structure. Timelines, comparisons, authorization trails. She did not rely on interpretation. She relied on sequence. When the bank records arrived, the pattern became unmistakable. The authorization Stephen had signed at the branch stood out immediately. Not because it was aggressive, but because it was explicit. Sole control, permanent deactivation, no consultation. The language was unambiguous. Lauren cross-referenced it with earlier notifications alerts Madison had saved when access was restricted without explanation. She matched those to Stephen's messages, which framed the changes as temporary or necessary. The discrepancy mattered. Lauren added the public context, the branch location, the open desk, the presence of witnesses, the security camera angles Madison had noted. Then came the audio. Madison had not recorded Stephen secretly. She had no need to. The bank's own system had done it. Calls, in-person interactions captured under institutional policy. Lauren requested the relevant segments formally. The recording was brief, professional, clear. Stephen's voice was unmistakable. She doesn't earn money. She doesn't need access. I handle all finances. Lauren listened without expression. She did not replay it. She didn't need to. When discovery expanded to include transaction history, another inconsistency emerged. Stephen's claim of financial constraint did not align with his behavior. Transfers out, personal spending, account closures without corresponding redistribution to joint obligations. Lauren did not frame this as malice. She framed it as control. Madison was updated methodically. No speculation, no reassurance, just facts. This establishes unilateral restriction, Lauren said during a brief call, and it contradicts his stated rationale. Madison acknowledged the information calmly. Stephen, on the other hand, began to feel pressure. His initial confidence faded as requests multiplied. Clarifications were needed. Explanations required precision. Casual answers no longer sufficed. He grew defensive. He spoke more sharply at home. He questioned Madison indirectly, asking whether she had shared information, whether she had spoken to anyone. Madison answered truthfully, I keep records. Stephen frowned. Why? Madison met his eyes. Because it's responsible. The word unsettled him. Stephen hired a lawyer late in the process, choosing someone recommended by a colleague. The attorney reviewed the materials quickly and asked a question Stephen hadn't anticipated. Did your wife consent to these changes? Stephen hesitated. She didn't object. That's not the same, the attorney said. Stephen bristled. I didn't do anything illegal. The attorney didn't argue. Intent will matter less than documentation. Stephen realized then that the situation was no longer theoretical. It was procedural, and procedure did not bend easily to confidence. Madison continued her routine. She did not reference the discovery. She did not react to Stephen's agitation. She maintained consistency. Lauren submitted supplemental materials emails. Madison had saved notes, taken contemporaneously bank acknowledgments. Each piece reinforced the same narrative without commentary. Stephen attempted to explain his actions in writing. His responses emphasized responsibility, protection, concern. They did not address the absence of consent. Lauren read them carefully and placed them in context. During a preliminary review session, Lauren summarized the findings succinctly. "This is not about whether he believed he was right," she said. "It's about whether he had the authority to do what he did." Madison listened. "And did he?" Lauren closed the file. "That's not looking likely." The process moved forward steadily. There were no raised voices, no dramatic revelations, just the slow accumulation of facts. Stephen felt the ground shift beneath him, not because Madison confronted him, but because the story he had told himself no longer aligned with the record. At home, he tried once more to assert control. He questioned Madison's spending. He reminded her of their agreement. He spoke about loyalty. Madison listened. She did not engage. She understood now that Stephen was reacting to loss, not of money, but of certainty. The certainty that his version of events would go unchallenged. Lauren scheduled mediation. Madison agreed. She did not feel anxious. She felt ready, because by the time discovery closed, there was nothing left to uncover. The facts stood where they were placed. The pattern was complete. Stephen had declared control publicly. He had exercised it privately, and he had documented it himself. Madison closed her notebook that night with the same calm she had carried throughout the process. The truth no longer needed protection. It was already on record. The mediation room was smaller than Madison expected. Neutral walls, a long table, water glasses placed at equal distances as if symmetry alone could guarantee fairness. There were no windows, no clock. The space was designed to minimize distraction and maximize focus. Stephen arrived first, his attorney beside him. He looked composed, too composed. The confidence he carried now was more brittle than before, but he wore it carefully, like something that could crack if handled roughly. Madison entered a few minutes later with Lauren Whitman. She did not carry a folder. Lauren did. Madison took her seat without speaking. The mediator introduced himself, reviewed ground rules, and reminded everyone that the purpose of the session was resolution, not argument. Stephen nodded frequently, eager to appear cooperative. Madison listened. Stephen spoke first. "I want to be clear," he said, folding his hands on the table. "I never intended to harm anyone. Everything I did was to protect our household." The mediator nodded. "Thank you." Miss Campbell Madison did not speak immediately. Lauren leaned forward slightly. "We'll respond after reviewing the record," Lauren said. Stephen's attorney shifted, preparing to counter. He opened his notebook, scanning notes he had written quickly in the days leading up to this meeting. He expected disagreement. He expected negotiation. What he did not expect was silence. Lauren slid the first document across the table. Not dramatically, just enough to place it squarely between the parties. "This is the bank authorization, signed by Mr. Campbell," she said. "Permanent deactivation of secondary cards. Sole control declared." Stephen glanced at it. Yes, that was necessary at the time. Lauren nodded. For what reason, Stephen answered quickly. Spending concerns. Lauren placed a second document beside the first. "This is the transaction history for the same period, Mr. Campbell's discretionary spending increased by 27%. Stephen frowned. "That's not..." Lauren raised a hand gently. "We'll get there." She added a third document. "This is the audio record from the bank branch." The mediator looked up. Audio. Lauren pressed play. The recording was brief. Stephen's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. "She doesn't earn money. She doesn't need access. I handle all finances." No one spoke when the audio ended. Stephen shifted in his chair. That was taken out of context. Lauren did not argue. She placed a fourth document on the table. "This is the timeline Miss Campbell kept. Dates, times, notifications. Each entry corroborated by bank records." Stephen's attorney leaned forward, now scanning the pages more carefully. Lauren continued. We are not alleging intent. We are presenting sequence. The mediator cleared his throat. Mr. Campbell, do you dispute these records? Stephen hesitated. No. But Madison spoke for the first time. May I ask a question? She said, her voice calm. The mediator nodded. Madison turned to Stephen. When you told the banker I didn't earn money, were you certain? Stephen blinked. Madison waited. Stephen glanced at his attorney. I didn't know otherwise. Madison nodded once. So you didn't ask? Stephen stiffened. That's not the point. Madison's tone did not change. Then what was the point? The question landed softly and stayed. Stephen's attorney attempted to redirect. Mr. Campbell believed he was acting in the best interest of the household. Lauren responded without raising her voice. Belief does not grant authority. The mediator interjected, attempting to de-escalate. Perhaps we can discuss next steps. Lauren agreed. Certainly. Based on the record, our proposal is straightforward. She outlined it carefully. Asset separation, financial protections, a formal acknowledgement of unilateral restriction, no punitive language, no public statements. Stephen listened, his expression tightening with each point. This is excessive, he said finally. I didn't do anything illegal. Lauren met his gaze. We're not here to decide that today. The mediator nodded. Mediation is about agreement. Stephen looked at Madison then, not with anger, but confusion. Why didn't you just tell me he asked? Madison held his gaze. You didn't ask. Silence settled again, heavier this time. Stephen exhaled sharply. You made me look like a villain, Madison replied evenly. You described yourself. Stephen's attorney placed a hand on his arm, signaling restraint. The mediator summarized options. Settlement, continued litigation, the risks associated with each. Stephen's confidence, once expansive, now narrowed. He asked questions. He sought clarification. The authority he once assumed no longer carried him forward. Madison remained still. When Stephen finally agreed to the proposed terms, it was not with acceptance, but with calculation. He signed because the numbers demanded it, because the record left little room to maneuver. As the meeting concluded, the mediator thanked everyone for their cooperation. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Papers were gathered. Stephen stood, hesitated, then spoke again. I was trying to keep things together. Madison looked at him calmly. Control isn't the same as stability? Stephen had no reply. Outside, the hallway felt brighter than the room they had left. Madison walked beside Lauren without speaking. You did well, Lauren said quietly. Madison nodded. It was just questions. Lauren smiled faintly. Those are often the hardest. They parted without ceremony. That evening, Madison returned home alone. The house felt unchanged, but something fundamental had shifted. The silence no longer felt imposed. It felt chosen. She sat at the kitchen table and reviewed the final documents once more. Not to relive the process, but to close it. Stephen would move on. He would tell his version of events to those willing to listen. Madison did not concern herself with that. Her story was already complete. She placed the documents in their folder and set it aside. The work was done. The second public moment did not announce itself as such. There were no raised voices, no gathering crowd drawn by conflict. It unfolded the way institutional consequences often do, quietly in spaces where people expected routine. The setting was the bank again, though not the same branch. This one was larger, closer to downtown, where executives held meetings behind glass walls and decisions were made with polished discretion. Madison had not chosen the location. Lauren had. There were reasons for that. Stephen arrived late, visibly irritated. He had assumed the matter was settled after mediation. Papers signed, terms agreed. He believed the uncomfortable part was over. Lauren greeted him politely, professionally. Madison stood beside her, composed, carrying nothing. They were escorted into a conference room where two bank representatives waited. One was a senior manager. The other was compliance. Both had tablets open. Both had already reviewed the file. Stephen sat down with an air of restrained impatience. "I don't understand why this meeting is necessary," he said. "Everything's been resolved." The senior manager smiled neutrally. "We're not here to reopen anything, Mr. Campbell. We're here to clarify." Madison noticed how carefully the word was chosen. Lauren spoke first. "This concerns prior authorizations and account representations." Stephen sighed. "I've already explained." The compliance officer raised a hand gently. "We'll need to confirm a few details." He turned his tablet so it faced the table. On the screen was a familiar document, the authorization Stephen had signed months earlier, enlarged and annotated. "On this date, the officer said you declared sole financial control and stated that your wife had no independent income. Is that correct?" Stephen nodded. "At the time, yes." The officer scrolled. "And this statement was made publicly in branch and recorded." "Correct, yes," Stephen said, irritation creeping in. The officer nodded. "We've since received documentation that contradicts that representation." Stephen froze. Madison felt the shift immediately. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The room leaned forward, not physically, but procedurally. Lauren slid a folder across the table. "These are executed contracts in which Miss Campbell is the authorized signatory. All payments are documented. All approvals verified." The senior manager opened the folder and reviewed the contents carefully. He did not react. He did not need to. Stephen's attorney, who had joined the meeting remotely, cleared his throat through the speaker. "These contracts were not disclosed previously." Lauren responded evenly. "They were not required to be disclosed at that time." The compliance officer looked up. "Miss Campbell, can you confirm that these contracts were active when the authorization was signed?" Madison spoke calmly. "Yes, and income was already being generated." "Yes." The officer nodded slowly. "Then the representation made at the branch was inaccurate." Stephen leaned forward. "I didn't know." The senior manager met his gaze. "But you stated it as fact." Silence followed. The officer continued. "We take misrepresentation seriously, especially when it results in the restriction of another account holder's access." Stephen's confidence fractured audibly. "Are you saying I violated policy?" The senior manager did not accuse. "We're saying the record reflects an imbalance created under false assumption." Madison watched Stephen's face change not into anger, but something more revealing. Confusion, disorientation, the realization that his certainty had not been enough. The officer added, "We'll be issuing a formal correction to our internal record. Additionally, we'll be restoring Miss Campbell's access in accordance with policy." Stephen opened his mouth to object, then closed it. He had no ground to stand on. The compliance officer looked at Madison. "We apologize for the inconvenience." Madison nodded. "Thank you." The apology was brief, institutional. It mattered anyway. As the meeting concluded, Stephen remained seated, staring at the table. Lauren gathered the documents efficiently. Outside the room, as they walked toward the elevator, Stephen spoke again. "You planned this." Madison stopped. She turned to face him, her expression unchanged. "I documented," she said. "That's not the same thing." Stephen shook his head. "You let me believe," Madison interrupted gently. "You believed without asking." The words were not sharp. They didn't need to be. Stephen had no reply. In the lobby, a familiar face approached the banker from the first branch. She paused when she saw them, recognition flickering briefly. "Mrs. Campbell," she said politely. Madison nodded. "Hello?" The banker glanced at Stephen, then back at Madison. "I remember that day." Madison did not respond. The banker hesitated, then added, "I'm glad things were clarified." Madison met her eyes. "So am I." Stephen turned away. The moment passed quietly. No one stared. No one whispered. But something irreversible had occurred. Stephen's public declaration had been corrected publicly. Not with humiliation, but with record. In the days that followed, the consequences unfolded predictably. Stephen's accounts were adjusted. His authority narrowed. The narrative he had built that he was the sole provider, the only competent steward, lost its institutional support. At work, he noticed the shift almost immediately. Questions were phrased more carefully. Assumptions were checked. The ease with which he once moved through meetings was gone. Madison heard none of this directly. She did not need to. Her own work continued unaffected. Contracts executed, payments flowed, systems functioned. Lauren checked in briefly. Everything proceeded cleanly, she said. Madison thanked her. That evening, Madison returned to the house one last time. Not to argue, not to collect proof, just to gather what was hers. Stephen was not home. She moved through the room slowly, noting the absence of tension more than its presence. The house felt lighter, not because it had changed, but because she had. She packed deliberately. Essentials, documents, personal items. Nothing rushed, nothing left unfinished. On the kitchen counter, she left a note. It was brief. I've arranged for my accounts to be separate going forward. Communication can go through counsel. No accusations, no explanations. Madison closed the door behind her and did not look back. The public moment had passed. What remained was not victory, but resolution. The legal resolution did not arrive as a single event. It unfolded through documents, signatures, and deadlines, each one quiet, precise, and irreversible. Lauren Whitman handled the settlement the way she handled everything else, without flourish. The terms were practical, grounded in statute and precedent. Asset separation, financial protections, clear boundaries going forward. There was no language of punishment, no attempt to extract apology through clause or condition. The law Lauren understood did not exist to satisfy emotion. It existed to restore balance. Stephen signed where required. He did so without protest, though his hand hesitated once before the final page. The hesitation meant nothing legally. It meant everything personally. The settlement acknowledged what had already been established by record unilateral restriction of access, misrepresentation to a financial institution, and a pattern of financial control, inconsistent with shared marital authority. It did not label him an abuser. It did not need to. The structure of the agreement reflected the conclusion implicitly. Madison reviewed the final draft in silence. She read every clause carefully, not because she distrusted Lauren, but because attention was part of who she was. When she finished, she nodded once. "This works," she said. Lauren did not smile. She simply closed the folder. "Then we're done." The formalities concluded in an office that looked like every other office Madison had been in during the process, neutral, functional, indifferent to the significance of what had just occurred. There were no congratulations, no expressions of relief, only completion. Stephen did not speak to Madison directly during the final exchange. His attorney handled communication. Stephen stood slightly apart, his posture stiff, his gaze unfocused. He looked like a man trying to locate the moment when control had slipped from his hands and failing to find it. Afterward, Stephen's professional life began to shift in subtle but undeniable ways. Nothing dramatic happened. He was not fired. No public announcement followed him. There were no whispered scandals that reached Madison's ears. Instead, there was a cooling, a recalibration. Institutions remembered. The bank adjusted its internal notes. The compliance correction did not vanish after a meeting. It became part of Stephen's profile, quietly flagged, carefully contextualized. Future requests were reviewed more closely. Assumptions were no longer granted. At work, Stephen noticed a similar change. Decisions that once moved quickly now required additional approval. Colleagues asked more questions. Authority that had once been assumed now had to be demonstrated. Stephen told himself it was coincidence. Market conditions, corporate restructuring. Anything but consequence. Madison did not follow these developments closely. She learned of some indirectly through formal notifications, through changes in shared obligations, through the absence of Stephen's presence in her daily life. She did not seek updates. She did not ask Lauren for details. The legal outcome had been secured. What followed was no longer hers to manage. Madison moved into a temporary apartment, first small, clean, quiet. She chose it for its proximity to transit and its lack of emotional weight. There were no memories attached to its walls, no negotiations embedded in its silence. She unpacked methodically. She arranged her workspace first, before the kitchen, before the bedroom. Her laptop documents and notebooks found their places easily. This was familiar ground. Her professional work continued without interruption. Contracts executed, meetings scheduled, payments processed. Nothing about her work required Stephen's absence to function. If anything, the clarity of separation improved efficiency. Madison noticed the difference immediately. She no longer had to explain where time went. She no longer had to anticipate reactions. Her days moved forward without friction. Lauren checked in once more as a formality. "If there's any further contact from him outside agreed channels, let me know," she said. Madison nodded. "There hasn't been." Lauren paused. "That's good." Madison did not interpret that as reassurance. She understood it as closure. Stephen attempted to reach out once indirectly through a message forwarded by counsel. It contained no apology, just confusion, a suggestion that things had escalated unnecessarily. Madison did not respond. She had learned that explanations offered after consequence were rarely about understanding. They were about discomfort. The settlement finalized on a Friday afternoon. Madison received the confirmation while reviewing a contract addendum for a new client. She acknowledged it, archived the message, and returned to her work. There was no ceremony. That evening, she walked through her neighborhood as the sun set, noticing details she had previously overlooked: the sound of traffic in the distance, the pattern of light through apartment windows, the rhythm of her own steps. Nothing about the world had changed. Only her position within it. Madison reflected briefly, not on Stephen, but on the process. She thought about the early moments when silence had felt heavy rather than intentional. When documentation had begun as instinct rather than strategy. When she had still believed that clarity could be achieved through explanation. She understood now that some systems did not respond to explanation. They responded to structure. Stephen had not lost because Madison confronted him. He had lost because the system he relied on required accuracy, and he had provided assumption instead. Madison did not feel triumphant. She felt intact. Her dignity had not been restored through victory. It had never been lost. It had simply been constrained. Now it was unencumbered. The final legal notice arrived the following week, confirming full compliance with the settlement terms. Madison read it once and set it aside. There was nothing left to address. Stephen's chapter in her life closed not with confrontation, but with administrative finality. His absence became ordinary. The silence where his authority had once loomed felt neutral, not liberating, not painful. Just quiet. Madison understood that this was what resolution looked like when it was real. Not a reversal of harm, not a spectacle of justice, but a recalibration of reality to reflect what had always been true. She closed her laptop and turned off the light. Tomorrow would be another workday, another set of decisions, another sequence of actions governed by clarity rather than control. And that was enough. Madison did not wake up on her first morning alone with a sense of victory. There was no sharp intake of breath, no moment where relief flooded in and rewrote her understanding of the past. She woke the way she always had, quietly, deliberately aware of the light filtering through the blinds and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. The difference was not emotional. It was structural. Her day began without negotiation. She brewed coffee and sat at the small desk by the window, reviewing her schedule. 2 calls, 1 document revision, an invoice confirmation. The work was familiar grounding. It reminded her that her life had never truly stopped moving forward. It had only been constrained by someone else's need to control its direction. Madison worked efficiently, pausing only when necessary. She took notes by hand, as she always had, before transferring key points into her system. There was no one to interrupt her concentration, no expectation that her time was secondary to someone else's priorities. She noticed the absence gradually. Not Stephen himself, but the constant calculation that had accompanied him. The subtle assessment of tone before speaking, the anticipation of reaction, the mental editing. Those reflexes faded slowly, like muscles unlearning tension. In the weeks that followed, Madison settled into a rhythm that felt both new and deeply familiar. Her professional commitments expanded naturally. Referrals came from people who valued reliability over visibility. She did not seek recognition. She accepted responsibility. Her income remained consistent, transparent, documented. There was no secrecy now, not because secrecy had ever been the goal, but because autonomy no longer needed protection. Madison found a more permanent place to live, a modest apartment with clean lines and good light. She chose it for its practicality, close to transit, quiet, unimpressive in a way that allowed her to focus on what mattered. She unpacked slowly, each item placed deliberately. Nothing symbolic, nothing performative, just order. Stephen did not contact her again directly. Through counsel, there were a few procedural messages, confirmations, acknowledgments, final closures. Each was brief. Each concluded without emotion. Madison responded only when required. She did not expand. She did not explain. She understood now that closure was not something another person could grant. It was something that emerged when there was nothing left to clarify. Occasionally, Madison thought about the moments that had defined the shift. The bank lobby, the dinner table, the mediation room. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. She saw them now as points on a timeline, not as wounds. They were evidence of something she had learned slowly, that power asserted through control always depended on silence, and that silence, once documented, became language. Madison did not tell her story widely. She did not correct narratives Stephen might still be telling. She understood that stories told to protect ego rarely survived contact with reality. Her dignity did not require an audience. One afternoon, while reviewing a contract addendum, Madison paused and looked out the window. A familiar thought surfaced, not regret, not anger, but recognition. She had never been powerless. The systems that had constrained her were not stronger than she was. They were simply louder. And when confronted with structure, contracts, records, procedure, they had revealed their limits. Madison returned to her work. The days passed without incident, without spectacle, without reversal. That was the point. She began mentoring a younger colleague remotely, someone new to contract coordination who struggled with being overlooked in meetings. Madison offered practical advice. Speak when it matters. Document everything. Let accuracy do the work. She did not mention Stephen. There was no lesson there worth repeating. Madison's life moved forward, not as a response to what had happened, but as a continuation of who she had always been. Methodical, observant, precise. There were moments of quiet satisfaction, not in having been proven right, but in having trusted herself when it would have been easier to doubt. She did not feel hardened by the experience. She felt clarified. On a Friday evening, Madison closed her laptop and prepared dinner. Nothing elaborate, something simple. She ate at the table alone without distraction. The silence was not heavy. It was neutral, honest. She thought briefly about the word broke, how casually it had been used to define her, how easily it had been accepted. She understood now how language could shrink people when left unexamined. She also understood that she had not needed to correct the word. She had needed to outgrow the system that gave it power. Madison washed her dishes and set them to dry. She turned off the lights and stood for a moment in the doorway of her kitchen, feeling neither loss nor triumph. Just balance. Her phone buzzed once, a calendar reminder for a meeting the following week. She acknowledged it and set the phone down. There was nothing left to prove. Madison went to bed that night with the same calm she had carried through the entire process. Not the calm of resignation, but the calm of someone who knew where she stood and why. The world had not changed to accommodate her. She had simply stepped into her own authority. The story you've just followed isn't about money contracts or even marriage. It's about something quieter and far more common. It's about how easily control can disguise itself as care, and how often silence is mistaken for weakness. Madison never won by shouting. She didn't win by humiliating anyone or demanding the world admit it was wrong. She won by staying observant when it would have been easier to react. By documenting when others dismissed. By trusting process over impulse. Her strength wasn't loud, and that's precisely why it endured. Many people are taught that power looks like dominance. Who speaks the loudest, who pays the bills, who makes the decisions. But real power, as this story shows, often looks like patience, like preparation, like knowing when to wait and when to act. Madison understood that dignity isn't something you reclaim after it's taken. It's something you protect by refusing to abandon yourself, even when others try to define your worth for you. This story also reminds us that justice doesn't always arrive as spectacle. Sometimes it comes as paperwork, as records, as quiet corrections that realign the truth with reality. And that kind of justice, though less dramatic, lasts longer. It doesn't rely on applause. It relies on accuracy. If you've ever felt underestimated, controlled, or reduced to a version of yourself that didn't feel true, this story is for you, not because it promises revenge, but because it shows another way forward. A way that preserves your integrity. A way that lets facts speak when words would be dismissed. A way that ends not with humiliation, but with balance. Before you go, we'd love to hear from you. What part of Madison's journey resonated most with your own experiences? Have you ever had to choose silence, patience, or documentation over confrontation? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone. And if stories about quiet strength, legal truth, and dignity without spectacle matter to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Not for drama, but for stories that stay with you long after the video ends. Thank you for being here.